Hi, welcome everyone. My name is Pratham. I'm from Cow Corner Cricket Cast, joined by my friend today, Gurkirat. And today we're going to be talking about something that is sort of a break from what the cricketing landscape has been for the last month and a half. We've been talking a lot of the discourse on cricket has been centered around T20s. The World Cup has been happening in Australia, but we're starting to see Test series come into fruition now, back after the World Cup, and so we're going to start talking about it. And one of the series that we in particular find very interesting to talk about, preview in this case, is the upcoming series between Bangladesh and India that's going to be played in Bangladesh. So before I get started, if you guys don't know Gurkirat already, it's kind of hard. If you don't, he has a very active social media presence, especially on Twitter. He has his own podcast and show, Gupshup with Gill. He's also on cricket.com or TV, from my understanding as well. Does a very good segments there. But yeah, Gurkirat, happy to have you on the show, and just curious, what are your thoughts leading into this upcoming series?
Looking forward to previewing this test series between India and Bangladesh, and hoping for a good result for India, because if India have to play the World Test Championship, they will need to win this test series 2-0 and get as many points as possible.
Indeed, and it's great that you mentioned that last point, because the way that the World Test Championship is situated, India have two more series that technically can qualify them for the final left, and that's this series versus Bangladesh, and the other Test series is against Australia. Now that's a 4-match Test series at home, so yes, there is going to be home advantage, quote unquote, for India, but Australia are a pretty good Test side. They won in Pakistan 1-0. So their record, and drew in Sri Lanka 1-1. So their record in the subcontinent of late is not as abysmal as conventionally the thoughts are regarding their performances. They have a good side that could compete in Indian conditions potentially. So it's not going to be a cakewalk for them to win that series. And the way that the World Test Championships is currently structured, India are currently fourth in the cycle rankings, and if they don't, they have a win percentage of about 52, and they need to get that really to close to above like 67%, almost 2/3 of a win percentage, really, to qualify. And so realistically, the only way they're going to do that is if they win the series 2-0, and they win the Australia series convincingly, ideally 4-0, but 3-0 might also do. Here they might be able to win 1-0, but it makes things very difficult. So the incentive for India to do well, and for India to come into the series and really compete as if their life was meant on it, it is really there. For Bangladesh, the incentive for doing well in the series is a bit different. It's not so much qualifying for the World Test Championship final, because quite frankly they are in a pretty bad position when that's concerned. They are pretty much near the bottom of the rankings. Nothing they do in the series will matter to change that. But for them, I would say, Gurkirat, it's more about just a case of pride at this point, right? Of and then desire to show that they can compete internationally, in conditions even favorable to them. Because if you look at their record this World Test Championship cycle, they had a great win against New Zealand, a momentous win, if anything. But if you honestly look at the overall record that they've had here, it's been pretty poor, to say the least. I mean, they've lost every series that they played in, barring that one series against New Zealand, which they drew 1-1 against. And what's been more disappointing for them is when they've even got prototypically favorable conditions that you would associate with the Bangladeshi side in the past, that being surfaces that turn a bit, surfaces that are more favorable towards batsmen and spinners than pacers, like they did in the recent series against South Africa. It was a bit of a atypical series. Normally you go to South Africa, you think you're going to have fast bouncy wickets, or variably bouncy wickets that are seaming around a bit. They'll help the pacers, but the wickets that they got to play in this recent tour to South Africa that they played against were actually pretty firm, hard, dry wickets that sort of spun a little bit, and they really got spun out pretty convincingly. Yeah.
In fact, if you look at it, the first test that they played in New Zealand, that also had a flattish kind of a look to it, and batting wasn't difficult on that pitch. I think the other thing for Bangladesh here is that they need to, even if they lose the series, they need to have show that they can compete, in the sense that it's been 20 years now that they have been given the test match status, and they haven't really shown as much progress as they would have liked. And along with it, they want to show that why, how much have they been improved as a test side, and how much can they compete. So that is one thing. Like they should be going out to prove that the win in New Zealand wasn't a one-off or wasn't a fluke, to say it is something that they are capable of repeating and recreating.
So yeah, we that sort of covers the motivations, I would say, for the two sides entering the series. But let's talk about actually now where the series is going to be played. And it's a 2-match test series, and they're going to be playing on 2 separate venues. One of them is the Zahoor Ahmed Chaudhary Stadium in Chattogram, formerly known as Chittagong, and then the second one is going to be at the Sher-e-Bangla Stadium in Dhaka, Mirpur, the Mirpur district to be precise. And so really I'd say the key takeaway to look into this, right, is what sort of pitches are going to probably get there. What are the outfields going to be like? Are they going to, how are they going to affect stroke play? And then what's the actual conditions atmospherically going to be in terms of weather? Are we going to actually get the days of play that we would like to see in a test series or not? Those are sort of the fundamental questions sort of addressed diving in when we're talking about those venues. So let's get to that. So the first test, as we mentioned, is going to be played in Chattogram. Now, Gurkirat, I from what I've seen with that surface in Chattogram, at least in the 5 years, and what I've heard, it's developed a reputation of being prepared to be very flat, notoriously flat. And in the stats and the actual matches that have been played in those last 5 years sort of bear that out. Because if you look at the 6 games that have been played there since 2017, there were 7 that were scheduled. One was sort of the Australia tour that got cancelled. But there have been 6 games that have been played there. 4 of them were on really slow, low roads. And by slow, low roads, I mean it was so bad that in 2018, for example, in a test series against Sri Lanka, they played on a pitch that was so lifeless that Sri Lanka made 700 plus, and they weren't bowled out or dismissed. And the ICC had to come in and actually declare that as a below average pitch because it was that poor of a surface for bowlers.
I was just looking at the numbers. Even in the 4th innings, the batting average is 30 for a team innings. So a batting average of 30 plus in the 4th innings is actually quite good. Just goes on to show that maybe the pitch doesn't deteriorate at all as the match goes on.
Definitely something I noticed. Because you remember the Kyle Mayers 200 earlier. On debut. That actually happened in Chattogram. And it's really a surface where the pitch doesn't deteriorate, which is a huge factor. From the recent history, we can sort of infer at least that most of the time you're going to get a wicket at Chittagong that's pretty, or Chattogram as it's called now, that is pretty slow, low, flat, and just pretty hard work when it concerns bowlers of all stripes, pacers or spinners alike. So that's one thing that you would notice about the first test. The second test is going to be a little bit more interesting, though, Gurkirat. And in terms of matches that I've seen there in Mirpur, there have been a couple of really exciting matches that I've seen. But it's a surface which sort of demonstrates Bangladesh's mindset. Now, when you were growing up and you saw a couple of the matches between Bangladesh and India, one of the things that would definitely stand out to you, I'd imagine, is some of the spinners, especially the left arm orthodox spinners. They have a tradition of producing some of those as well. And I think their strategy here is kind of similar to actually a strategy that India would use in the mid 1990s. They were going through a rough patch in the late 1980s to early 1990s. They'd gone overseas. They'd lost, they'd played 25 test matches. They'd won one against Sri Lanka and Sri Lanka. So they were really going through a bad patch. And then there was a strategy devised to create these like relatively donor friendly services. And they would take like a subset of three spinners. Anil Kumble was one of them. And then they would try to win on these, pitches that were sort of produced and specifically for that purpose. And what I see here with Mirpur specifically, not so much in Chittagong, but definitely in Mirpur, is that there's a propensity of wickets that are prepared to be turners. If not outright dust bowls, definitely turners. And again, the past record shows that, you have got about 4 out of the 7 matches that have been played there that have been on these sort of really turner or, spin heavy or spin friendly surfaces at hand. And it's funny because I was mentioning the part with the below average pitch earlier for Chattogram and how it was too flat. So they had the complaint for Mirpur, but it was the exact opposite, that it was too inconsistent in bounce and turn. So I guess it's hard to please the ICC either ways if you're preparing a pitch in in Bangladesh. So that is going to be a factor that's going to come in. You just generally get the main factor is you just get a little more bounce than Chattogram from what I've seen. And that's helpful because what basically that entails is that you get some assistance for the quicks and the spinners alike. So it's not a ground where necessarily only spinners can thrive. Asita Fernando, there was a recent series between Bangladesh and Sri Lanka at home, and Asita Fernando and Kasun Ranjita, who are two fast medium bowlers. They actually did well. They took I think 8 or 9 wickets between them in one of the innings actually. So it's a ground where you can get some assistance. It's going to be an interesting sight to see, right? Because you could very much see a pitch that is, that attracts the ire from many circles for being too turgid, and then you see one that could be very, it could attract criticism for being too spinner friendly or too bowler friendly in the same series, which is kind of a fascinating prospect. You don't often see that in a 2-match test series. So yeah, I mean, the pitches themselves are interesting, but the other factor that is pretty relevant for where it comes to batting and bowling that you kind of have to evaluate is the state of the outfields. And both of these outfields tend to be such where the grass cut fairly low, they're fairly well maintained or kept. At most they might be on the slightly drier side with some dead patches of grass. So really what that all goes to show is that they're generally going to be pretty fast. And so you're going to get value for your shots. The Sher Bangla Stadium actually has a very good drainage system as well. So they're not going to even have to worry about rain, slowing down the outfield and making it particularly heavy, I'd imagine, as opposed to some of the other stadiums at hand. And the reason why I'm bringing that up actually is sort of relevant to the forecasts as well, Gurkirat. So the forecasts that are predicted at the moment aren't really, it's far out, right? So, take what I'm saying with a huge grain of salt with this, because 10 days out, a weather forecast can be, less than 0.5%, less than 50% accurate. So it's not a do or done sort of situation, really. But what's predicted is that the first test is going to be played in pretty, basking sunshine as far as it's concerned, and then the second test is really where you're going to start seeing a lot of rain come through. I think the 3 out of the 5 days it's scheduled to be overcast and to the point where it's going to probably rain a bit. So that normally would be a concern when you're talking about the outfields, but because of that drainage system, I don't think that's going to come into effect. And I think you're going to have a situation where you're going to get 5 days of full play in the first test, and you might get a curtailed test match in the second test. So moving away from the venues themselves and moving on to what is going to probably most directly impact the play, that being the players themselves, let's talk about the squads. So, Gurkirat, you've noticed a bunch of interesting changes from the last time. Some that you would say are a product of being, circumstances really, and some that have been just sort of interesting inclusions and omissions regardless. So would you care to share some details about them, and what are your thoughts in general about India's squad for this tour?
So, India squad, I think, again, unfortunately, a few players missing out due to injury. There's Shami, who will not be playing. There's Jadeja, who might be out as well. Reports are suggesting that Mukesh Kumar will replace him, and Jaydev Unadkat is probably set to make a comeback after 12 years. 2010, I thought he wasn't ready, but now he seems to be more suited. However, I don't see how he plays ahead of Siraj or Umesh. I think they'll still be the two pacers that India go in with, along with three spinners. And out of those three spinners, I believe uh, Ashwin and Akshar are a lock. Maybe third spinner will be Kuldeep, or maybe Mukesh Kumar. I'm not sure. Could be any one of them.
It's Saurabh Kumar, just to clarify.
Sorry. Mukesh Kumar is the pacer. Yeah.
No.
So there's that. And now I think even if Rohit may not be out of the squad, but I think it's difficult for him to play in the test match, in the first test, which again, might have added Abhimanyu Easwaran to the squad, who's the Bengal captain and has been a feature of India for quite some time. But I think if that happens, then Gill will open with KL Rahul. Gill, KL Rahul, Pujara at 3, and Pujara is an important player at 3 because of how the pitches are going to be. Although his recent record in Test matches in India hasn't been quite great because he got dropped because of that, and something that we discussed earlier as well. So there's that, and then kohli at 4. I believe Shreyas at 5, Pant at 6, Akshar at 7, Ashwin at 8, and then 3 bowlers. And if you have Ashwin at 8, then I think it makes sense to go for the better bowler or probably add variety, because Saurabh Kumar is also a left-arm spinner like Akshar, so you could go with Kuldeep to add more variety to the attack. With Kuldeep and then the two pacers who I said would be Siraj and Umesh. If India do play with the third pacer, if the conditions are like that, then I believe maybe someone like Jaydev Unadkat will play, but apart from that, I see it difficult.
See, that is a really interesting point, especially the point that you made about the idea that they'll probably go with two pacers. Because obviously another member of the squad is Shardul Thakur, who's another option that they could look at if they wanted to strengthen the if they wanted a tail that wasn't as didn't have as poor of a record with the bat. That could be another third seamer they could play and potentially use as an all-rounder. I mean, he scored 50s in England, for example, so he's no mug with the bat. So that could be an option that they could consider as well. So he's also a member of the squad at hand. Now, coming to the team that's actually going to be hosting Bangladesh, the squad is very interesting, actually. So we have a situation where 3 people are getting their call-ups back into the squad. Mushfiqur Rahim, who's a former Bangladeshi captain himself, also a former wicketkeeper, and gave up the gloves to become a better batsman. And for a good part of the last, I'd say 7 or 8 years, has been one of Bangladesh's key batsmen. So he's going to assume a spot probably in the side as a batsman to shore up their middle order. We've sort of alluded to the issues with the middle order in general and just that batting in general. So a little bit of experience with a player who's of that quality, comparatively speaking, might help them. Yasir Ali's another middle order bat as well, Gurkirat. I would say he's a little bit more, he's definitely more untested because he hasn't played much Test cricket, but he's also a younger player. So he also bowls a little bit of off spin. He's not particularly, like earth-shattering from my understanding, but fairly serviceable, 6 bowler sort of stuff. So he's there. And then the biggest news and probably the most exciting news for me is Taskin Ahmed, the man who has been sort of lighting it up for Bangladesh, comparatively speaking, in the World Cup, the past T20 World Cup. Also played in this recent ODI series, the very last match. He makes a return to this test setup as well. And He's going to be an interesting character to look at. I'll talk about him a little bit more later when we you know actually see him bowl during the series. I'll definitely keep an eye on him for that. But he's a very interesting bowler, and he is interesting to me because he was probably the most threatening bowler. Not necessarily the best bowler on show, but probably the most threatening bowler on show. The last time these two sides met, way back in 2016, 2017 for the inaugural, one of the inaugural test matches that both sides played in India. He bowled a very inspired spell during then, and he's the one of the fast bowlers that I would say that has a chance of really showing some penetrative skill going forward. But yeah, he's in the squad. We do have a situation where Tamim Iqbal is out of the setup, but that's more down to, again, sort of like Rohit. That's a product of injury and just fitness concerns there. So it's an interesting squad. We'll talk more about what I think is going to be their starting 11 a bit later, but I think most of the selections seem fairly reasonable in my mind. There are a couple where I'm still a little bit uncertain. Someone like Mominul Haq, who's endured a very torrid time in the last couple of years and really has struggled outside of Bangladesh in a lot of instances. He retains a spot in the squad, and there is a concern that maybe that might be a bit unearned given the disastrous tenure that he had. I tend to stick with him and try to give him more chances just because of the state of how much paucity is in the Bangladeshi batting lineup. Somebody who even does score in Bangladesh for a series in Bangladesh, given their struggles, would be very useful in that regard. So I can understand why they stick with him. But really, apart from that, I think most of the squad selections have been fairly reasonable. There are a couple of new names there as well. Rahman Raja, who hasn't played much, who's a medium fast bowler. But yeah, on the whole, I think both squads are, relatively speaking, logically and reasonably selected given the constraints at hand.
We've already heard from me what's going to be the Indian 11. Now I'm going to go to Pratham and ask him about the Bangladesh 11 and who he thinks could be the major factors and the key players for Bangladesh, which might have a say in how this test series goes.
In terms of the predicted playing 11 that I would see for Bangladesh in this particular test match, my inclinations lean towards 11 where you're going to start off with one of the openers being Mahmudullah Hasan Joy. Now he's a youngster. He hasn't had the best of times, if we're being completely honest, in the setup, but I think that he will keep his place in the squad mainly because Tamim Iqbal, the other opener that you would say is the main figure in this lineup, has been injured. So he, in any other circumstance, I would imagine him being dropped, but now I can actually see him making a return and keeping a spot in the side. I think he'll be joined by Anamul Haq. Now, Anamul Haq is normally a middle order batsman. He's even in previous matches for Bangladesh, in the previous series, he played at number 4, number 5. But with the paucity of opening options in this squad, especially given that even one of the reserve batsmen, Yasir Ali, is a middle order batsman, I get the sense that they might move him up the order. So I think Mahmudullah Hasan Joy and Anamul Haq will open, and that will leave Najmul Hasan Shanto, who's been the sort of long-term investment they've tried for a long period of time now, at number 3 to assume his spot. And that would also leave the position of number 4 then for the most senior batsman and the most probably pure batsman. Obviously Shakib is there, but I think as a pure batsman, the one who they probably trust the most of that spot would be Mominul Haq. I think Lynn Das will be at number 5. Shakib Al Hassan will be at number 6. Nurul Hassan is the wicketkeeper, so he'll slot in at 7. And then the bowling attack that I think they'll go with, given that Shakib is in the side and he can obviously bowl a lot of overs with his left arm spin, I think they'll rely on Mehdi Hasan Miraz as the off-spinning all-rounder to shore up a little bit of the batting, but also be that sort of bowling option they have. And then I think they will play 2 pacers, and those 2 pacers would be Ibadat Hussain, who's going to bat at, I would assume, 9, and Taijul Islam, who would bat at 10, with Taskin Ahmed starting in at that number 11 spot. That I could, however, see Momin ul Haq losing his spot, given that sort of disastrous reign of performance, to Mushfiqur Rahim, who would slot in at number 4 as a top order batsman. That's really the only source of contention, though. I think that their lineup going into this first test is fairly well sorted out. As for the players that I think will be critical for Bangladesh's chances in this contest, I would say really the 5 names I can think of, and they're all there for different reasons, varying reasons, Gurkirat. So the first one that comes to my mind that now I think a lot of Indian fans know about, given his exploits in the ODI series, they might have been perhaps a little bit less aware of him earlier on, is Mehdi Hasan Miraz. Now, Mehdi Hasan Miraz is a off-spinning, low order all-rounder, essentially, and he scored 100 in the second ODI, and was instrumental in that 38 odd that won them the first ODI and the ODI series leading up to this Test match series. So there is a temptation to rate him or put his stocks very high going into the series. I don't quite share that optimism, even though Miraz's overall statistics as an off-spinning bowler that can bat a bit aren't necessarily all that poor on first impression. I mean, he averages 34 with the ball, 19 with the bat. Those aren't necessarily, the most egregious numbers by any means. Especially
do you think it's fair to say that he's maybe a light version of someone like Dhananjay De Silva for Sri Lanka? Well, not exactly like him, but a cricketer of the same mold.
I would say that he is much more, his main skill is much more oriented towards the bowling side of things.
While Dhananjay De Silva is more of a batter.
Yeah. But it's good that you bring up Dhananjay De Silva, because even though, Mehdi Hasan Miraz's primary skill that he's in the side for, being that, frontline second spinner option, would indicate that, that's what he's here to do. His actual stats, if you sort of break them down a little bit further, it doesn't paint a very pretty picture, because his case is really inflated by some bashing of what I would say are very weak batting lineups produced in series at home. I'm talking about West Indies and Zimbabwe here, and the pitches that were produced where he did really well were very close to being ranked turners, if not outright, ranked turners in themselves. And his record against top quality opposition, right? Because obviously, if you do well, it's not necessarily a knock on you, right? That you perform well in conditions that are very favorable to you against a weak batting line. That's not in of itself a problem. But what makes it a bit of an issue is that when that's not really reflected, even to a decent degree, those performances are reflected when facing better quality teams in less favorable circumstances. And his record against top quality opposition, or even lower quality opposition that's mid-ranked, when the surfaces aren't suited to him, it doesn't really, again, it paints him as a very innocuous option. I'll just bring up the example of India here. In the 2 tests that he's played against them, he's averaged over 100. And it's not only India. His record against a lot of top teams is very, very poor. I think the only 3 teams that he averages under 35 are England, Zimbabwe, and the West Indies. And yeah, the one standout feature that I think some spinners need to have often when they're playing on flat surfaces is something that he lacks. And that's one of the things that I observed when he was playing in those India test matches. He's very predictable. And spin is spinners are one of the entire points of spin is it's an art of deception, as some famous cricketers in the past have put it, and he doesn't really keep the batsman guessing on a flat surface or even honest, right? Because the thing about those performances in India, again, I mentioned them to bring up the context. He went at over 4 runs and over combined, and so he'll really want to prove that he can put up a meaningful performance against a top quality side, especially when the wicket isn't really conducive to his skill set. And to that point, I think there is actually a solution to this. I think that if he could learn a weapon similar to something that was used by a former spinner, it would be very helpful to him. The spinner that I'm referring to here is a former English off spinner, actually, by the name of John Emburey. Emburey, he was actually in a similar situation to Miraz is at sometimes, even though he played for a much stronger side back in the 80s. England were a mid-ranked team. Bangladesh aren't such highly ranked. He often, because of the nature of the pitches involved and because of the nature of the composition of the attacks involved, had to play this very defensive or containing role. And it was often on wickets that weren't really responsive to his style of bowling. So if you look at his overall average, John Emburey's, it doesn't make for very pretty numbers. He had a very long career, but he averaged 38 as a consequence of that, of those factors I mentioned. But the thing with him is, like Mehdi, he could bat a bit, and probably, he averaged like 23 with the bat. But more importantly, unlike Mehdi, he could trouble quality batsmen on a wicket that didn't even necessarily do that much. So I can remember a test match, for instance, where he took a 5 against the West Indian team of the 80s, right? And I think the reason why he was such an effective bowler, a more effective bowler than necessarily the stats would belie at times, was because he had a new type of delivery that he developed. And what it was is, he was a medium pacer in his early days, and he switched to bowling spin. It's a very common story for a lot of spinners to medium pacers and vice versa. But with Emburey, what that allowed him to do was he had in his arsenal a ball that was disguised with the grip of an off spinner, but it was actually an outswinger to the right hand. And he did it by having the seam of the ball sort of canted just slightly away from the right hand. The seam angle obviously is very important to get the ball to swing in a certain way. And because of that, he was able to disguise the grip a little bit better as well. He was able to, keep the batsman honest, and everything wasn't easily being able to be played to leg as a result. Even though I think, there are some things about Emburey's action that aren't similar to Miraz's, and his action in particular, he had a delayed arm pull, so it gave him a little bit more of an advantage than Miraz does. I think that if Mehdi was to sort of develop that variation, and he could release it at a similar speed to what he bowls now, mid 80s, even like the high, the early to mid 90s would actually be a great pace, because scientific studies show that the ball swings the most in the air when it's at a 90 to 110 kilometers per hour, depending on the study. And so he could, if he was to develop a variation like that, it wouldn't have to be significantly quicker to what he's already bowling. And it would make it so that at least the right-hand heavy batting lineup of India have to treat him with a little bit more respect. They don't get to just knock him around or just hit boundaries at will against him. And the other part of it is Mehdi Hasan. One of the changes I've noticed, Gurkirat, I don't know if you've observed this in the ODI series, he's tending to come a little bit closer to the stumps now and bowling closer to the stumps to the right-handers. And again, it's just a matter of an angle, right? So if you have a ball that can go slightly away from that angle, you don't need to do much to get the edge. But yeah, I think he's one of the main players. Liton Das, I would say, is the other big player. He's probably the one shining light, honestly, that Bangladesh can take positives from, and what's been pretty much a period of incredibly gloomy, prospects for them as a side at large. Because in the last 17 Test matches over 3 years, he's averaged over 47 with the bat, and a lot of the times, not always, but I'd say about 2/3 of the matches, he's done this while keeping. And it's not only just about the runs, it's also about the situations he's batted in that even adds further to the value of those runs, you could say, because a lot of the times he's come in where his side was in a pretty precarious position, 3 down, 5 down, batted from 5 to 7, and because of Bangladesh's struggles with the batting at large, they've often had not many runs on the board. He's played against pretty top quality pace attacks. New Zealand's comes to mind, and he's done it with consummate ease. He's destroyed attacks with consummate ease, you could say. I mean, he's hit, if I'm not mistaken, he hit Bolt for 5 4s and an over, right? And it didn't look like he was trying even. It was just effortless. And the other thing is the conditions haven't always been favorable for the batsman either in those circumstances. So all of those things considered, even though he's probably going to be batting max at number 5 in the series, he's going to be very important for them. He's made 300s in that period that I mentioned earlier. Bangladesh, I think, will look desperately to just continue that sort of rich vein of form and they'll rely on him making 100 of significance, ideally a daddy 100, 150, I think, if they want to acquit themselves honorably or do well in the series. So I think those two players are probably the most critical of the lot. Some of the other ones that come to mind, and it's actually one that I remember talking to you at one point, being very interested about his progress when we were just communicating and chatting, was Ibadat Hussain. So Gurkirat, in terms of Ibadat Hussain, I want to ask you actually, what have your impressions been of him of late? Because you were watching the ODI series, you definitely saw a couple of his spells. You definitely had some thoughts about that. So what did you think about him at large?
I've spoken of him early on before. I think he definitely has the pace and the bounce to trouble batters, especially when Bangladesh are playing against not so good ODI teams or teams which are from the subcontinent, and that pace and bounce may not work for him when he's bowling to batters who are actually good against pace and bounce, because it's not just the pace that troubles him, trouble those batters. You also have to be consistent, but his pace is such that he can bully sometimes inferior batting attacks or batters who struggle against pace. So definitely has the potential, and we saw what he did in New Zealand earlier this year when Bangladesh won that test match. So I feel, if and when the ball goes old and it's reversing, his pace can come in handy, provided he's disciplined enough to attack the stumps. Because I still think that he's learning, he still is sort of developing his craft. A lot of bowlers like Ibadat who come onto the scene with sheer raw pace, they need to be taught the nuances of how to use that pace, right? Sometimes you have to be taught that at what times you just have to attack the stumps with your pace and you will get wickets. The pitch and the conditions will do the rest for you. And sometimes when there's nothing happening, that is the time when you have to go in and pitch it short and see how the batter reacts. Or you have to set up the batters in a certain manner where you just push them behind and then bowl the sucker ball full enough and see if they react in time. So
yes.
Ibadat that way, I think, can trouble someone like Shreyas. I think he got Shreyas out with the bouncer in the first ODI.
He did.
Yeah. So, but apart from that, I don't think his pace alone can trouble the other batters. He might, if he gets it right, he might just help Bangladesh clean up India's tail a lot better if he gets it right. But in that top 6 that I mentioned, I think he only troubles Shreyas a lot, because I have not seen him get a lot of movement otherwise, barring the odd occasion. So that's what I feel about him. But he's still someone Bangladesh should persist with and see how they do.
One of the things I noticed about Ibadat, I've been recording speeds of his, and in that match that he came back in the T20, he was clocking in excess of 145 a couple of times, 146. So he, as you mentioned, he has a lot of pace and bounce. But one of the things I noticed was, since his sort of re-entry into the side, this might be something that Alan Donald has worked on with. I'm not entirely certain, but it looks like his momentum through his run-up looks a little bit better, and that's what has allowed him to bowl even quicker than beforehand and consistently touch those low 140s speeds. And as you mentioned, I think the reverse aspect, that pace could be very useful in helping him clean up the tail. Now, part of what you were mentioning in terms of him needing to be more disciplined and more consistent is reflected by his average. He averages 60. I mean, that's not a good average for a fast bowler in any metric. But yeah, the 6-4 is important point, and I should mention the 6 for that he took there in New Zealand. It did not come on a green top. It came on a pretty firm, dry pitch, and then he took a 4 for as well in South Africa, and again on a firm sort of flat pitch, right? And so I think he likes bowling when the pitches are a little bit more firmer. So in the second Test match in Mirpur, I think he could be very handy. I think the one thing that he can sort of, and what Bangladesh would be hoping to help him to gain that consistency that would be useful in wiping out the tail, like you mentioned, it has to do actually with his action. So he has a tendency of falling away. His head tends to fall away while bowling, and I think what that does is sometimes it makes it very hard for him to consistently. I mean, when you have that sort of lateral flexion going in your action, it makes it sometimes difficult for you to actually see and actually consistently maintain a line of length. So I think that's an important factor.
It's something that used to happen with Ishant Sharma as well early on in his career. Then he worked on that. So these are the things, like I said, they will always happen with new bowlers or who just come onto the scene. These things take a little time to develop, and hopefully he'll work on this. Tuskin is another player who, on the other hand, has now finally started to develop and mature. He's been around for some time. He was there in the 2015 World Cup as well. If I'm not wrong, I think he got Virat Kohli out in that quarterfinal of the World Cup.
So. Yeah. So, I mean, he took easily, from my understanding, the most amount of wickets for Bangladesh in that tournament. Yeah. Has a very high arm action, gets bounced as well. He also
got Rohit out after Rohit had scored that 130 odd and everything. So Tuskin is now has finally started to improve, and yes, he can, if there's movement available, he can cause issues. I think now we should talk a little about who would be key for India, and I believe one player who certainly hold the key for India is someone like Shreyas Iyer. I think these pitches are such which will suit his style of batting. He doesn't need to attack spin. He can play out the bouncers as well. He doesn't need to attack them. So I believe Shreyas and Pant will be important. Even if the top four doesn't click, I think India have enough skill set in terms of batting in 5, 6, 7, 8. That they can still put on enough runs on the board to challenge Bangladesh. And from there on, I do expect Ashwin and Akshar to do the job. I'm expecting Ashwin to take at least one 5-for. It's been quite long since Ashwin picked up a 5-for. I think he's taken a lot of wickets, and I think he's still stuck on 30 5-fors. And when he had taken 30, Anderson was also on 30. I think Anderson has now moved on to 32. And Ashwin last took a 5-for, I think, in 2021 when England were in India. He's picked wickets. I don't think he picked up 5-for against Sri Lanka. He picked 3 or 4 wicket hauls. So I'm expecting Ashwin to do well, take around somewhere between 10 to 15 wickets in total in the two test matches. And I'm expecting someone like Umesh Yadav to do well because again he's done well on similar wickets in India where he can just get the ball to skid off the surface at speed, and when the ball's reversing with his round armish action, he has such an action where batters start thinking that the ball's going to end up on the leg stump, and they start shaping up to play the flick, and then they realize the ball's being pitched on middle and off, and then it leaves them. He's got Faf du Plessis out like that in test matches a couple of times in India, and a few other batters as well. So I expect Umesh to do well.
One other thing about Umesh, really quickly here, there's an added motivation for him to do well in the series, I'd imagine, because now he's going to be like the senior sort of bowler, and I think for India especially if they don't go in with 3 spinners or if the wicket is very flat, I think Umesh will have to operate as a workhorse as well. And given that, I think that, and given the fact that he's been in and out of the side because there have been better bowlers that have been more consistently representing India, I think he's going to have a lot of motivation to try to put in a really solid performance.
Yes, somewhere the fact that Siraj has leapfrogged him to be the third pacer when Shami and Bumrah are playing should be hurting him. And there have been instances to show why it has happened. You look back at the Cape Town Test match. the third test in South Africa. First innings he bowled brilliantly. Second innings he was all over the place. He's never had consistency when India are playing away. And to think about it, that was his fourth tour to South Africa, and it was the first time he played a test match in South Africa. He was there in 2013. He was there in, I think, 2010-11, and he was there in 2018 as well, but never got a test match. And even this year, he finally got a test match when Siraj was injured and couldn't play the third test. So,
really good point.
Yeah, there has to be some motivation for him as well. Maybe if he does well, he'll just showcase that he's become a banker for India in these slow and low conditions, where as a pacer, both off the pitch and in the air, he can do enough damage. Little concerned about Virat because he's not averaged. He's averaged 30, I think, in the last 18-19 innings.
Slightly shy of that, actually. I think 28 in the last 32 innings.
Yeah. So you'd act, and it's not that he's not had the innings or he's not had the runs. He's had few very good 50s, but not been able to kick on. And if the pitches are what they are usually in Bangladesh, then again run scoring for him could be difficult. He did score 100 in the third ODI, but I think in the first 30-35 balls he was actually struggling. He was not able to time the ball at all.
Yeah, he accelerated a little bit at the end, and he was also helped by Kishan at the other end going gung-ho.
And then he got one boundary of Miraj where he pulled him, and then he came out, stepped down the track and hit Shakib over inside out. And I think from there on he got measured with the pace of the pitch and then started to sort of get those singles a lot more easy. Then pace was being bowled at him, and then he started to find his touch and boundaries. So I think the key for Virat to succeed in these test matches is him not playing enough from the crease, because if you have to play from the crease, you need a sweep, and you need to play sweep consistently. I don't think Virat does that, and I'm not sure if the Bangladesh bowlers will bowl him with a trajectory through which he can use his sweep. So he'll have to take those opportunities, that whenever the opportunity presents itself for him to come down the track and use his sweep and probably hit a drive or just a push, he should do that, because that will also ensure that the Bangladeshi bowlers, especially the spinners, don't settle into a length from where he can neither completely come forward or completely go back. Because if he's going to play from the crease, then he's going to find himself in trouble, and that is one thing that I think Virat needs to look out on, because I don't see him getting troubled by pace.
I tend to agree with you on that. I think one other person that you haven't mentioned that I'd like to make a note of actually is Mohammed Siraj. Now Siraj had a very poor fifth test against England. He went over 6 runs per over in that second innings, and even against South Africa, he averaged on the wrong side of 50. So his recent tours haven't been all that great, if we're being honest. And he had such a big bang to his career with the Border Gavaskar Trophy. At the very end, in the final match, taking a 5-wicket haul. But the luster seems to have worn off a little bit just from the current reading and the perception of him. And I really would find it interesting to see how effective he is here, because I think he likes to resort often to a specialty sort of delivery. And that specialty delivery at hand really has to do with, I'm not seeing too many people bowl it. It's a variety of the wobble seam ball, but the point of the release of the ball is such where the seam is at an angle, but the palm of the hand is straight. So it sort of comes out in a way where even though the seam is fluctuating in its position, on average it's pointing towards a deep mid-wicket area. And so what's happening is it's a wobble seam ball that is essentially spinning into the right hander like an off break. And on pitches where, especially on the second pitch in Mirpur, where there might be a little bit more tone on offer, when you combine that variation with his strategy sometimes in recent test matches to bowl cross seam to sort of generate that inconsistent bounce as a stock delivery, when the pitch isn't really doing all that much for pacers in terms of conventional lateral or seam movement, I think he has a skill set that would be very effective here in the wickets that are expected to materialize, at least for the series. So it's really going to be a matter for him to deliver here, I think, as well, because if he has a bad series here, his position might be risked to the side, and he might be dropped down that pecking order for a younger fast bowler in the wings.
If a lot of things work out for India in this test series, it will make both Rahul Dravid and Rohit Sharma easier preparing for the Border Gavaskar Trophy or selecting a sport. Or else, if things don't work out, then they again will have to, hope that Bumrah comes in, and when he comes in, he's back to his best straight away, because that is one series that you don't want to lose. So a lot of India don't have to, India have to worry and keep one eye on the World Test Championship and the next series as well, and not just about the series, which isn't really the case for Bangladesh. And I think that might just set up the series beautifully, because Bangladesh don't have a lot to lose, India have a lot to lose, and that might just play out differently for both the teams and might make it a little more interesting.
So finally, let's just turn to what we think is going to happen in this series. So, Gurkirat, what do you think is going to be the result of the series? Who's going to win, and by what margin?
I think India should win by 2-0. I'm saying these should be comfortable wins. I'm not really getting into if they'll be in this defeat or not, but they should be comfortable wins. India should win this series 2-0.
Fair enough. I'm gonna be a little bit contrarian here. I'm not really being that much of a contrarian. I think there is a possibility for a draw, but not because I think Bangladesh will necessarily put up a very strong showing in either of the test matches. I think they're going to be fairly comfortably on top India, but there is rain forecasted for the second test in Mirpur, or it's at least expected to be overcast for a significant period of the match. So I could actually see that test being washed out to a certain degree. But yeah, so for that reason, I would say 1-0, but I lean, and I can understand where the result could be a 2-0, and I tend to think that if not the 1-0, then that certainly would be the case. Do you have any predictions, just out of curiosity, in terms of who you think might be scoring the most amount of runs for India, and maybe take the most amount of wickets? Anything that you would like to share in regards to that?
Wickets that have to go with Ashwin. I think when it comes to runs, maybe Pant will score the most runs because he's been in good form, and I think by the time he'll come out to bat, the pitch would have settled down. He won't be always facing pressure bowlers. That's another thing. But I'd like for Shubman Gill to score a lot of runs.
He would get a chance to open as well in this series, right? So
I'd hope that Gill finally scores his first Test 100. He's had quite a lot of good 50s and sometimes not converted those starts. I hope he does that. So that's something that I want from the series.
Fair enough. And I'd say on the opposite spectrum of things, or opposite side in this case, Bangladesh, I would predict Lyndon Das to continue having a pretty good series. He had a little bit of a hiccup during that South Africa series, but all the Bangladeshi batsmen did. I think he really is the linchpin of their side. And now that he doesn't have to worry about wicket keeping either, that he's given up the gloves and Nurul Hassan is the designated wicket keeper at hand, I think that frees him up to concentrate on his batting even more, batting further up the order now at number 5 as opposed to where he was batting when he was wicket keeping around 6 or 7. It'll help him out even more. So I think he's due to have a pretty good series, and he's somebody they'll rely on a lot. Even though, like in your vein, even though I think he'll be the leading run scorer, I think the guy who I would like to see probably score the most amount of runs is Mehmudullah Hasan Joy. I think he's a very young, talented opener, very stodgy in some ways. Puts a price on his wicket. He did it in New Zealand when he compiled his 70 odd in one of his first Test matches. And I think he's somebody that Bangladesh will need to look at to persist with. He was also very good in the under-19 circuit. So I think he's somebody that I'd like to see develop as a young, promising player. In terms of wicket-taking options, we actually didn't mention him in the key players list, but that's because there isn't much to say anymore about him. I think a lot of things, for a long while, a lot of Bangladeshi fans are aware of his contributions at the Test level. And I think that's Taijul Islam. I think he'll be their leading wicket taker in the series at hand. He's a left-arm orthodox spinner, very classical mold, but just lovely. Gets lovely drift. Has a lot of control, and really has been one of their most consistent performers in hand. So I think he'll continue to have a good series. I think he'll like the fact that the right-handed dominated batsman of the Indian lineup again could that he turns it away from them, and he has a good straighter one as well. So I think he'll be in line to have a good series at large as well. So that's it from us today. We're glad to have brought our sort of analysis here at hand of this upcoming series. We hope to stay in touch with all our listeners going forward. Yeah, and just like, subscribe, comment, check out Gurkirat's channel on YouTube as well. And yeah, till next time. Bye.